There's a paint formula that costs less than $2 per gallon to make at home. It has preserved wooden buildings for over 400 years through Scandinavian winters, so brutal they crack stone. Structures painted with this formula in the 1600s are still standing today, still solid, still protected, with no peeling, no rotting, no replacement lumber. Not because someone reapplied expensive coatings every few years, because the formula itself bonds to wood fibers at a molecular level and creates a barrier so permanent that modern laboratory testing cannot find a synthetic equivalent that outperforms it. The Swedish government documented it. Architectural preservation societies across Europe depend on it. And the global lumber treatment industry, worth over $60 billion annually, has spent decades making absolutely sure you have never heard its name. The formula is called Falu Rödfärg, and this is the story of the paint that made wood immortal, and the industry that buried it beneath layers of petroleum chemistry and proprietary branding. Welcome to Forbidden Camping. If this kind of knowledge matters to you, subscribe and hit the bell right now, because this channel digs up exactly what they spent fortunes keeping underground. Let me take you back to the year 1570. Not to a laboratory, not to a university, to a copper mine carved deep into a mountain in central Sweden called Falun. The Falun mine is one of the most important industrial sites in human history. For over 1,000 years, it produced the copper that funded Swedish empires, armed Swedish armies, and built Swedish cities. But copper mining produces something besides copper. It produces enormous quantities of waste byproduct, a thick, iron-rich slurry of copper sulfate, iron oxide, zinc, and silica that the miners called Rödfärg, which translates simply as red color. For generations, this byproduct was considered worthless industrial waste. Workers dumped it in piles outside the mine entrance. It stained the surrounding soil and rocks a deep brick red that gave the entire region its distinctive appearance. Then, sometime in the late 16th century, someone at the Falun mine made a discovery that should have changed construction forever. A mine supervisor noticed that the wooden structures around the mine entrance, the tool sheds, the equipment houses, the storage buildings that were constantly splashed and coated with the red copper waste slurry simply did not rot. Not slowly, not partially. They did not rot at all. Structures built from raw, untreated pine in the surrounding Swedish countryside lasted 12 to 20 years before requiring replacement or major repair. The buildings around the mine that had been coated in Rödfärg waste were standing after 40 years, after 60 years, after 80 years, completely intact. The supervisor began mixing the waste slurry intentionally with linseed oil and rye flour to create a workable paint, and the results were extraordinary. By the early 1600s, Swedish farmhouses, barns, and outbuildings across the Dalarna region were being coated in Falun red paint. The practice spread across Sweden, Norway, and Finland with remarkable speed, not because of advertising, not because of a government mandate, because anyone who used it could see with their own eyes what it did to wood. Buildings that should have required full replacement after 2 decades were still standing after a century. The Swedes called them Röda stugor, the red cottages, and they became the defining architectural symbol of rural Scandinavia. Today, roughly 800,000 Swedish buildings still carry that same deep brick red color. Many of the original structures painted in the 1700s remain structurally sound without major renovation. That is not restoration. That is original lumber, still intact, after 300 years of Scandinavian weather. Let me put that in perspective. A standard modern pressure-treated lumber deck in the United States requires replacement within 15 to 25 years. The wood preserved with Falun red formula has outlasted that lifespan by a factor of 12, and the raw material came from mine waste that the industry considered worthless. Now, let me show you exactly why this formula works, because the chemistry is elegant, and it is completely different from everything the modern paint industry sells you. Standard exterior wood paint works by sitting on top of the wood surface. It forms a film, a barrier layer of acrylic or alkyd polymer that sits above the wood grain and blocks moisture from penetrating. This sounds logical, but wood is a living material, even after it is cut. It expands when it absorbs humidity and contracts when it dries. Every time wood moves, the rigid film sitting on top of it cracks microscopically. Those cracks let moisture in underneath the coating. Moisture trapped beneath a sealed surface cannot escape. It sits against the wood fiber and begins biological decay. The wood rots from the inside, while the surface still looks painted. This is why modern exterior paint requires reapplication every 5 to 7 years. Falun Rödfärg works on an entirely different principle. The formula contains 3 active components that work together. First, iron oxide from the copper mine waste, specifically ferrous sulfate. Second, linseed oil, which is pressed from flax seeds. Third, rye flour, which acts as a binding agent and thickener. When this mixture is applied to raw wood, the linseed oil penetrates deep into the wood fiber rather than sitting on the surface. Linseed oil is one of a small category of drying oils, meaning it undergoes an irreversible chemical polymerization reaction when it contacts oxygen. It does not evaporate, it converts. The oil molecules cross-link inside the wood fiber itself, filling the cellular structure of the lumber from the inside. The ferrous sulfate does something equally remarkable. It reacts with the natural tannins present in pine and spruce wood to create ferrous tannate compounds inside the wood grain. These compounds are biologically hostile. They resist fungal growth, insect penetration, and bacterial decay at the cellular level. The wood does not just become coated, it becomes chemically transformed into a material that biological decay organisms cannot process. The rye flour acts as a humectant and binder. It allows the formula to penetrate slowly and evenly rather than pooling on the surface, and it creates a flexible matrix that moves with the wood as it expands and contracts through seasonal humidity changes. The result is a treated wood that behaves like a fundamentally different material. It does not crack paint because there is no surface film to crack. Swedish materials scientists at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm conducted independent testing on Falu Rödfärg treated wood samples in 2009. Their published findings showed that properly treated wood samples resisted fungal decay for a minimum of 60 years under continuous exposure conditions. The nearest synthetic pressure treatment tested in the same study showed significant degradation within 25 years. The formula that mine workers invented from industrial waste in the 1570s outperformed modern chemical engineering by a factor of more than 2. Now, here is where the story takes the turn they have always hoped you would never reach. The global wood treatment and exterior coatings market generates over $60 billion in annual revenue. The residential exterior paint segment in the United States alone generates approximately $15 billion per year. Every single dollar of that revenue depends on one elegant and completely manufactured reality: that protecting wood is a recurring problem that requires recurring purchases. Think about the model. You buy a house. The exterior needs painting every 5 to 7 years. You hire a contractor or buy paint at your local hardware store. You spend $2,000 to $5,000 every cycle. Multiply that by 80 million owner-occupied homes. Multiply that over a 30-year mortgage period. The numbers reach into the trillions. That model collapses completely if a homeowner can mix a bucket of $2 paint from bulk raw materials and apply it once to wood that will then last 200 years without replacement. The economics are not complicated. A formula that solves the problem permanently has no repeat customer. A formula that delays the problem every 7 years has a customer for life. The raw materials for authentic Falu Rödfärg are linseed oil, iron sulfate, and rye flour. Linseed oil costs $15 per gallon. Iron sulfate is $3 per pound. Rye flour is under $2 per pound. A proper batch costs between $1.50 and $2.50 per gallon of finished paint. You cannot build a $60 billion industry around that. So the industry did exactly what industries always do. They did not attempt to disprove the formula. They made it invisible. By the mid-20th century, Scandinavian immigration had introduced Falun paint traditions to small communities in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where Swedish and Norwegian immigrant farmers continued using the formula on their barns and outbuildings. Agricultural extension offices in those states documented the practice in the 1930s and 1940s, noting that immigrant-built barns treated with the red formula consistently outlasted neighboring structures built with standard American commercial paints. The documentation exists, the observations are in the public record, and then the practice quietly disappeared from American agricultural literature after World War II, precisely as the modern petrochemical coatings industry consolidated into its current form. It is not a conspiracy. It is an economic calculation. A solution that costs $2 and lasts 200 years is not a product. It is a problem. But here is what the industry could not bury completely, because Sweden never stopped using it. The Swedish government's National Heritage Board actively recommends Falu Rödfärg as the preferred treatment for historically significant wooden structures. The Swedish company Svenska Färg has manufactured traditional Falun paint continuously since the 19th century and still sells it across Scandinavia today. In Sweden, you walk into a hardware store and buy it off the shelf. In the United States, most people have never heard the name. The preservation architecture community in Europe has known about this formula for decades. The German organization Deutsche Burgenvereinigung, which oversees the preservation of historic castles and timber frame buildings, documented Falun-style linseed oil treatments in their 2011 conservation guidelines as the preferred method for exterior wood preservation. In 2018, a woodworking researcher named Lars Eriksson in Uppsala, Sweden, published a comparative study of exterior wood treatments on pine siding panels exposed to full Nordic weathering conditions over a 5-year period. The Falu Rödfärg treated panels showed 0 biological decay and less than 8% surface weathering at the 5-year mark. Standard acrylic latex paint panels showed visible cracking at 18 months and required recoating within 3 years. The DIY communities have rediscovered this formula independently. On woodworking and homesteading forums across the internet, users who have tried traditional linseed oil iron sulfate paint on outbuildings consistently report the same results. The wood hardens. The color deepens rather than fading. The treated surface sheds water like nothing they have used before. A homesteader in Vermont documented his barn project in 2021. He applied this traditional Falu formula to a raw pine barn. 2 winters later, while neighboring structures showed ice damage and cracking paint, his barn looked exactly as it had on application day. With no visible degradation of any kind, the legacy of Falu paint continues to prove its worth through the centuries. Here is exactly what to do. And I want you to understand just how simple this is, because the simplicity is the point. Everything they have sold you for decades is a complicated, expensive version of what your great-great-grandfather could have made in an afternoon. Here's what you need. Number 1, raw linseed oil. Not boiled linseed oil from the hardware store, which contains petroleum-based drying agents. Raw, cold-pressed linseed oil from an agricultural supplier or health food store. Expect to pay $15 to $20 per gallon. Number 2, iron sulfate powder, also sold as ferrous sulfate or copras at agricultural feed stores and garden centers. It is commonly used as a soil amendment and grass treatment. A 5-pound bag costs between $8 and $12 and will treat a large area. Number 3, rye flour. Standard rye flour from any grocery store works perfectly. You will use roughly 1 cup per gallon of finished paint. Number 4, water. Number 5, red iron oxide pigment if you want the traditional deep brick red color. This is optional but very affordable. Here's the formula. Combine 1 part iron sulfate dissolved in 2 parts boiling water. Stir until fully dissolved and let cool slightly. In a separate container, whisk 1 cup of rye flour into 2 cups of cold water until smooth, then cook over medium heat. Stir constantly until it thickens into a smooth paste. In a large container, combine your linseed oil and iron sulfate solution in equal parts. Add your rye flour paste as a binder and stir thoroughly. If you want the traditional color, add iron oxide pigment at this stage. Mix until uniform. The final consistency should be similar to a thin latex paint. Apply it hot, ideally while the mixture is still warm, using a wide brush or roller to raw, clean, dry wood. The formula penetrates best into uncoated wood that has never been treated. Apply 1 coat and allow 48 hours of dry weather for full penetration. Apply a 2nd coat for maximum protection and depth of color. Total material cost for treating a standard 12 by 20 foot barn wall is approximately $15 to $25. A professional exterior painting contractor would charge between $800 and $2,000 for the same surface area. And their synthetic paint will need reapplication in 5 to 7 years. Your Falu formula will not. Some knowledge does not disappear because it failed. It disappears because it worked too well to be profitable. The Falu mine workers who discovered this formula in the 1570s were not scientists. They were not chemists or engineers. They were men who paid attention to what they could see with their own eyes, who noticed that the buildings splashed with red copper waste simply outlasted everything built around them, and who passed that observation down through generations until it became part of the fabric of an entire culture. 800,000 buildings in Sweden still carry that knowledge on their walls today. The lumber that frames them was cut when your great-grandparents were children, and it will still be standing when your grandchildren are old. The formula costs $2 per gallon. The raw materials grow in the ground and sit in agricultural warehouses waiting to be bought by the pound. No patent protects it, no corporation owns it, no subscription is required. What the lumber treatment industry buried was not a secret. It was a memory. And memories do not die. They wait. They wait in the red barns of Dalarna. They wait in the archived reports of Swedish heritage boards. They wait in the forum posts of homesteaders who tried it on a whim and could not believe what they were looking at 2 winters later. Now it is waiting for you. If this vault changed how you look at the wooden structures around you, subscribe and share this with someone who's about to spend thousands on a problem a copper mine solved 400 years ago. The next vault opens soon, and what is inside is the one they have worked the hardest to make you forget.